The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of the Geneva International Conference Center. Captain David Chun adjusted his earpiece and scanned the crowd of diplomats, journalists, and security personnel gathering for what everyone expected to be just another diplomatic meeting. After 15 years protecting important people at fancy events, David had seen it all. Or so he thought. Today was special, though. World leaders from over 60 countries had come to Geneva to mark 75 years since the end of World War II. The International Peace Assembly was being held in the same building where many peace treaties had been signed decades ago. The irony wasn't lost on David. He was protecting people who were celebrating peace in a world that still seemed full of conflict. David's team had been preparing for weeks. They'd checked every entrance, every exit, and every possible hiding spot in the massive conference hall. Security was tight, but not unusual for an event of this size. Presidents, prime ministers, and royal family members would all be in the same room. One mistake could make international headlines for all the wrong reasons. As people began arriving at 8 in the morning, David positioned himself near the main security checkpoint. This was always the busiest spot. Everyone had to pass through here, and everyone always seemed to be in a hurry. Diplomats rushed by with their leather briefcases, journalists juggled cameras and notebooks, and security teams from different countries tried to coordinate without stepping on each other's toes. The metal detectors beeped constantly. Phones, laptops, jewelry, belt buckles, everything set them off. David's job was to watch for anything unusual, anything that didn't fit the normal pattern. After 15 years, he'd developed what his wife called his sixth sense for trouble. It wasn't really magic, just experience and paying attention to details that others might miss. Around 9:30. As the morning rush was beginning to slow down, David noticed something different. An elderly woman was struggling with a large suitcase near the entrance. That wasn't unusual by itself. Lots of people traveled with big bags. But this wasn't a modern rolling suitcase like everyone else had. This was an old leather case, the kind people used to travel with decades ago. It looked heavy, and the woman was having trouble lifting it onto the security conveyor belt. The woman appeared to be in her late 80s, maybe early 90s. She wore a simple blue dress and a worn coat that had seen better days. Her gray hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her hands shook slightly as she tried to manage her luggage. But it was her eyes that caught David's attention. They held a mixture of determination and fear that he'd seen before in people carrying important secrets. Security protocol was clear. Anyone having trouble at the checkpoint needed assistance, not just for security reasons, but for basic human kindness. David approached the woman with a gentle smile. He'd learned long ago that being friendly was often more effective than being intimidating. "Good morning, ma'am. Can I help you with that?" David asked in English, then repeated the question in French and German. The woman looked up at him with surprise, as if she hadn't expected anyone to notice her struggle. "Oh, yes, thank you," she replied in heavily accented English. Her voice was soft but steady. "This old thing is heavier than it used to be. Or perhaps I am just getting weaker." David carefully lifted the suitcase onto the conveyor belt for the X-ray machine. The case was indeed heavy, much heavier than it should have been for its size. As it passed through the scanner, David noticed the operator frowning at the screen. She called over her supervisor, who took a closer look and then gestured for David to come over. "There's something unusual in there," the supervisor whispered. "Lots of paper, which is normal, but the density is strange. It's packed really tight, and there are some metal objects we can't identify clearly. Could be nothing, but..." David nodded. This was exactly the kind of situation his training had prepared him for. He walked back to the elderly woman who was watching nervously from the side. Other travelers were starting to back up behind her, some checking their watches impatiently. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to take a look inside your suitcase," David explained gently. "It's just routine. Sometimes the machines can't see everything clearly." The woman's face went pale. Her hands, which had been shaking slightly before, now trembled visibly. She clutched her purse tighter and took a small step backward. "Is ... she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "No problem at all." David assured her. This happens several times a day. We just need to make sure everything is safe for everyone attending the assembly. The woman looked around nervously, as if checking to see who else might be watching. Then she leaned closer to David and whispered something that made him pause. Please, sir, this must reach the assembly today. I have waited 75 years for this moment. 75 years. There was something in her voice, a desperate urgency that went far beyond normal travel anxiety. David had questioned thousands of people at security checkpoints, and he'd learned to read the difference between normal nervousness and something deeper. This woman wasn't trying to hide something dangerous. She was trying to protect something. Precious, what's your name, ma'am? David asked kindly. Helena. Helena Kozlov, she replied, her accent making the name sound like music from another era. Well, Mrs. Kozlov, why don't we step over here where it's a bit quieter and you can show me what's in your case? I promise we'll be very careful with everything. Helena hesitated for a long moment, looking at the suitcase as if it contained her entire world. Then she nodded slowly and followed David to a private screening area, away from the main flow of people. As David prepared to open the case, he noticed details he'd missed before. The leather was cracked with age but had been well cared for. There were old travel stickers on it, faded labels from hotels and train stations with names he recognized from history books. The brass corners were tarnished but solid, and the locks looked like they'd been opened and closed thousands of times over many decades. Helena stood beside him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Please be gentle, she whispered. Some of those papers are very old and fragile. David nodded and carefully unlatched the first lock. The click seemed to echo in the small room. Helena took a deep breath, as if she'd been holding it for 75 years and was finally ready to let it go. Neither David nor Helena could have imagined that opening this ordinary-looking suitcase would change their lives forever and rewrite parts of history that the world thought it already knew. As David's fingers moved to the second lock, Helena closed her eyes and whispered something in a language he didn't recognize. Later, he would learn it was a prayer of gratitude to a father she'd never been able to properly honor until this moment. The second lock clicked open with a sound that seemed to carry the weight of decades. David lifted the lid slowly, expecting to find clothes or personal items like in most travelers' luggage. Instead, he found himself staring at something that made no sense at first glance. The suitcase was packed completely full of papers. Not just any papers, these were yellowed with age, some so old they looked like they might crumble at the slightest touch. They were organized in neat stacks, each bundle tied with faded ribbon or held together with rusty paper clips. The smell that rose from the case was distinctive: old paper, leather, and something else David couldn't identify. It smelled like history. Mrs. Kozlov, David said carefully, what exactly are these documents? Helena's eyes filled with tears, but she stood straighter, as if a burden she'd carried for decades was finally being shared. They are the truth, she said simply. The truth that my father died protecting and that I have kept safe for 75 years. David reached for the top bundle of papers, moving slowly to show Helena he meant no harm. The papers were covered in handwriting in several different languages: German, French, what looked like Polish, and others he couldn't identify. But even more surprising were the official stamps and letterheads he could see. Some bore symbols that made his blood run cold. Are these from World War II? David asked, though he already knew the answer. Helena nodded. My father worked for the German government during the war, but he was not what people thought he was. She paused, struggling with words in a language that wasn't her native tongue. He saved people, many, many people. These papers prove it. David's training kicked in. Documents from World War II, especially ones with German government letterheads, could be extremely sensitive. They could also be extremely valuable to historians, museums, or people looking to understand what happened to their families during the war. But they could also be dangerous if they contained information that certain people didn't want revealed. Mrs. Kozlov, I need to ask you some questions, and I need you to be completely honest with me, David said gently. Are you planning to give these documents to someone at the assembly today? Yes, Helena replied without hesitation. I have tried for years to find the right people to give them to. Government offices, museums, historical societies, they all said the same thing. File a request, fill out forms. Wait for approval, but I am 89 years old. I cannot wait anymore. David looked more closely at the papers. Even though he couldn't read most of the handwriting, he could see that these weren't random documents. They were organized, categorized, and clearly had been maintained with great care. Some appeared to be official correspondence. Others looked like lists of names and addresses. Still others appeared to be maps or diagrams of some kind. Mrs. Kozlov, can you tell me more about your father? What exactly did he during the war? Helena was quiet for a long moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. Finally, she began to speak in a voice so soft David had to lean closer to hear her. My father's name was Wilhelm Kozlov. He worked in the German Foreign Ministry in Berlin from 1940 to 1945. To everyone around him, he was a loyal Nazi official. He attended the meetings, he signed the papers, he did everything that was expected of him. She paused, her hands trembling. But at night he worked for the other side. David felt a chill run down his spine. The other side? The Allies. The resistance. Anyone who was trying to save innocent people from the camps, from the deportations, from the killings. Helena's voice grew stronger as she continued. He used his position to warn people when raids were planned. He helped create false documents. He provided safe houses. He saved thousands of lives. This was far beyond what David was trained to handle. If Helena was telling the truth, the suitcase contained evidence of one of the most extraordinary double-agent operations of World War II. But if she wasn't telling the truth, or if she was confused about what the documents actually contained, he could be looking at something else entirely. Why didn't your father reveal this after the war ended? David asked. Helena's laugh was bitter. Because in 1945, nobody wanted to hear that a Nazi official had been a hero. The world wanted justice, and justice meant punishment for anyone who had worked for the German government. My father knew that even with proof of what he had done, he would likely be executed or imprisoned. So he stayed quiet, and he made me promise to stay quiet until ... quote. Until what? Until enough time had passed that the truth could be told without causing more pain than healing. Helena gestured toward the assembly hall. Today, 75 years later, with world leaders gathered to celebrate peace and remember those we lost, I believe the time has come. David realized he was in an impossible situation. Protocol said he should confiscate any suspicious documents and turn them over to his supervisors for investigation. But his instincts told him that Helena was telling the truth, and that these documents might be exactly what she claimed they were, proof of heroism that had been hidden for 3/4 of a century. Mrs. Kozlov, I want to help you, but I need to follow security protocols. These documents will need to be examined by experts before they can be brought into the assembly. Helena's face fell. How long will that take? Usually several days. Maybe weeks. I don't have weeks, Helena said firmly. I am 89 years old, and my health is not good. I have already waited 75 years. If I don't do this today, I may never get another chance. David looked at the elderly woman standing before him, clutching her purse with hands that had held these secrets for most of her lifetime. He thought about his own grandmother, who had passed away the previous year at 92. She had often talked about things she wished she had done differently, chances she wished she had taken, words she wished she had spoken before it was too late. Mrs. Kozlov, what exactly are you hoping will happen if you get these documents to the assembly? I want the world to know that not everyone who worked for the German government was evil. I want the families of the people my father saved to know what happened to their loved ones. I want his name cleared, and I want the other people who helped him to be remembered as heroes instead of criminals. Helena reached into her purse and pulled out a small faded photograph. It showed a middle-aged man in a German military uniform standing next to a young woman holding a baby. This is my father, and this is me when I was 6 months old. This Picture was taken in 1943, right in the middle of his secret work. Look at his eyes. Do you see a monster? Or do you see a man who was trying to do the right thing in an impossible situation? David studied the photograph carefully. The man in the uniform did not look like the cold, heartless Nazi officials he'd seen in history documentaries. His eyes were kind, tired, and somehow sad. He looked like someone carrying a heavy burden. Mrs. Kozlov, I'm going to make a decision that could get me in serious trouble with my supervisors, David said finally. But sometimes doing the right thing means taking a risk. Helena looked up at him with hope and fear in equal measure. I'm going to allow you to bring one document, just one, into the assembly with you today. You can choose which one you think is most important. The rest will need to stay here for proper examination. If that one document convinces the experts that your story is true, then we can figure out how to handle the rest. Helena's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were tears of gratitude. She carefully sorted through the bundles of papers, finally selecting a single sheet from near the bottom of the case. It was covered in handwriting and bore several official stamps. This, she said, holding it up with shaking hands, is a list of 300 Jewish families that my father helped escape from Berlin in 1944. It includes their real names, their false identities, and where they were sent to safety. If even one person in that assembly recognizes a name on this list, they will know I am telling the truth. David took the document carefully, noting how Helena reluctantly let it go, as if she was handing over a piece of her soul. As he looked at the faded ink and official stamps, he realized that in the next few hours, this single piece of paper might change everything. Not just for Helena, but for hundreds of families around the world who had never known the full truth about what happened to their loved ones during the darkest period in human history. David couldn't stop thinking about the document in his jacket pocket as he escorted Helena through the final security checkpoint. The single sheet of paper felt like it was burning a hole through the fabric. He'd made copies for the security team to examine while Helena attended the assembly, but even the brief glimpse he'd gotten had shown him names, dates, and details that looked incredibly authentic. As they entered the Grand Assembly Hall, David was struck by the enormity of the moment. Here were representatives from nations that had been enemies 75 years ago, now sitting side by side to commemorate peace. The irony that Helena, carrying secrets from that very war, was walking among them wasn't lost on him. Helena moved slowly but with purpose, her eyes scanning the massive room filled with world leaders, diplomats, and historians. She seemed to be looking for someone specific, though David wasn't sure who. Mrs. Kozlov, is there someone particular you're hoping to meet today? David asked quietly as they found seats in the section designated for special guests. Helena nodded, pointing toward a group of elderly people sitting in the front row. Holocaust survivors and their families. Every year, fewer of them are able to attend these ceremonies. I was hoping that maybe someone here would recognize the names on my father's lists. The assembly began with speeches from various world leaders about the importance of remembering history to prevent its repetition. As David listened, he couldn't help but think about the suitcase full of documents locked away in the security office. If Helena's story was true, those papers contained details about history that the world had never heard. During a break between speakers, Helena approached one of the elderly survivors, a woman about her own age who was sitting with what appeared to be her family. David stayed close, ready to intervene if needed, but something about Helena's gentle manner put everyone at ease. "Excuse me," Helena said softly to the woman. "My name is Helena Kozlov. I was wondering if I might show you something?" The woman looked up curiously. "Of course, dear. I'm Ruth Goldman. This is my daughter Lisa and my grandson Michael." Helena carefully pulled out the document David had allowed her to bring. "This is a list of families who were helped to escape from Berlin in 1944. I'm hoping you might recognize some of the names." Ruth put on her reading glasses and began to study the paper. As her eyes moved down the list, her expression changed, from polite curiosity to shock, then to something approaching disbelief. This can't be right, Ruth whispered. This name here, Samuel and Rebecca Goldman, those were my parents' names. And this address, this was our address in Berlin before we fled. Helena's eyes filled with tears. Your family was helped? By my father. He worked secretly to save people during the war. Ruth's daughter Lisa leaned over to look at the document. Mom, are you sure? How is this possible? I remember now, Ruth said, her voice growing stronger. There was a man who came to our house in the middle of the night. He had papers for us, false identity documents. He said someone in the government had arranged for us to be taken to safety. We never knew who it was. We always wondered. Michael, the grandson, was now studying the document with intense interest. Grandma, look at this. It's not just your parents' names. It shows where you were taken, the safe house in Switzerland, the people who helped you cross the border. This is incredibly detailed. Word began to spread through the survivor section. Other families gathered around to look at Helena's document. One by one, people began recognizing names, their own family members, friends, neighbors who had mysteriously disappeared one night never to be seen again. But instead of being taken to concentration camps, according to Helena's list, they had been taken to safety. Mrs. Kozlov, said an elderly man named Robert Fisher, my brother's name is on this list. Isaac Fisher? We were separated in 1943. My family was told he had been deported, and we assumed he had died in the camps. Are you saying he survived? Helena nodded eagerly. According to my father's records, Isaac Fisher was taken to a safe house in France, and later helped to escape to America. I have more documents that might tell you exactly where he went. The excitement in the survivor section was beginning to attract attention from other parts of the assembly. Historians, government officials, and media representatives started to notice the commotion. David realized that Helena's simple plan to share one document was turning into something much bigger. Dr. Sarah Weinstein, a prominent Holocaust historian who was attending the assembly, approached the group. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I couldn't help overhearing, Mrs. Kozlov. Are you saying you have documentation of previously unknown rescue operations during the Holocaust? Helena looked nervous about the attention, but she nodded. My father kept detailed records of everyone he helped save. Names, dates, locations, methods of escape, everything. Dr. Weinstein examined the document carefully, her trained eye looking for signs of authenticity. The paper is the right age, the ink appears period appropriate, and the level of detail is consistent with other wartime documents I've studied. But I have to ask, why are these records only coming to light now? Because my father made me promise to wait until it was safe, Helena explained. He knew that in 1945, no one would believe that a German official could have been working to save Jewish lives. He was afraid that revealing the truth would put the people he saved in danger, or that people would think he was lying to save himself from punishment. Michael Goldman, Ruth's grandson, had been quietly taking photos of the document with his phone. Mrs. Kozlov, I work for a genealogy company. We help people trace their family histories. If you really have more documents like this, they could help hundreds of families learn what happened to relatives they thought were lost forever. The implications were beginning to sink in for everyone gathered around Helena. If her father's records were authentic and complete, they represented one of the most significant discoveries in Holocaust research in decades. But more than that, they represented hope for families who had spent 75 years wondering what had happened to their loved ones. Dr. Weinstein turned to David. Officer, are there really more documents? Is this part of a larger collection? David found himself at the center of what was rapidly becoming a historical sensation. There's an entire suitcase full of documents. They're being examined by our security team and document experts right now. We need to see those documents, Dr. Weinstein said urgently. If they're authentic, they could revolutionize our understanding of resistance activities during the war. There are research teams around the world who have been looking for evidence of this kind of organized rescue operation for decades. Helena looked overwhelmed by the attention her simple gesture had attracted. I just wanted people to know that my father was a good man, not a monster. I wanted the families he saved to know the truth about what happened to their loved ones. Ruth Goldman took Helena's hand. Dear, you've given me something I never thought I would have. The truth about how my family survived. For 75 years, I've wondered how we were so lucky when so many others weren't. Now I know it wasn't luck at all. It was your father's courage. As more people gathered around Helena, David realized that security protocols were about to become much more complicated. The assembly had been planned as a commemoration of the past, but Helena's revelations were making it a rewriting of history. Phone calls were being made, experts were being summoned, and what had started as a routine security check was about to become an international incident. But looking at Helena's face, surrounded by the families of people her father had saved, David knew that despite the complications ahead, this was exactly what the elderly woman had hoped would happen. After 75 years of carrying her father's secret alone, she was finally able to share the burden and the joy of knowing that sometimes, even in the darkest of times, there were people willing to risk everything to do what was right. The document in David's pocket was just the beginning. In a few hours, when the experts finished examining the rest of Helena's suitcase, the real revelations would begin. And David had the feeling that by the end of the day, everyone in that assembly, Hall himself included, would see history in a completely different light. While Helena continued sharing stories with the Holocaust survivors, David received an urgent message on his radio. Dr. Peterson, the head of security, needed to see him immediately in the document examination room. The tone in the voice told David that whatever the experts had found in Helena's suitcase was significant. David made his way through the corridors of the conference center, his mind racing with possibilities. When he entered the secure examination room, he found Dr. Peterson, standing with 3 other people he didn't recognize, 2 women and a man, all wearing serious expressions. David, I'd like you to meet Dr. Rebecca Torres from the International Institute for Holocaust Research, Professor James Mitchell from Oxford University's Department of Modern History, and Agent Lisa Chun from Interpol's Art and Cultural Property Crime Unit, Dr. Peterson said. David shook hands with each of them, wondering why Interpol was involved. Agent Chun seemed to read his expression. When documents this significant surface, especially ones that could affect international relations and historical understanding, we need to ensure they're authentic and determine if they've been stolen. From any archives or museums, Chen explained. Dr. Torres gestured toward Helena's open suitcase, which was now laid out on a large table under bright examination lights. What we've found here is extraordinary. These aren't just random documents from the war period. This is a complete operational archive of what appears to be one of the most sophisticated rescue networks of World War II. Professor Mitchell picked up a bundle of papers tied with faded ribbon. Look at this organization. Everything is categorized by date, location, and type of operation. There are detailed maps of escape routes through Switzerland, France, and Denmark. Lists of safe houses with contact information. Even financial records showing how the operations were funded. David moved closer to examine the documents. Even to his untrained eye, the level of detail was impressive. These weren't hastily scribbled notes. They were careful, methodical records kept by someone who understood the importance of documentation. But here's what's really remarkable, Dr. Torres continued, holding up a leather-bound journal. This appears to be Wilhelm Kozlov's personal diary. And according to these entries, he wasn't just a German official who helped a few people on the side. He was coordinating with Allied intelligence services, resistance groups in multiple countries, and even some other officials within the German government. Agent Chin opened a folder containing what appeared to be official correspondence. These letters suggest that Kozlov was in regular contact with British and American intelligence officers. If authentic, they indicate that the Allies knew about his activities and were actively supporting them. Professor Mitchell looked up from a document covered in mathematical calculations. This is fascinating. Kozlov wasn't just saving random individuals. He was targeting specific people, scientists, artists, intellectuals, political leaders, People whose survival would be important for rebuilding European culture and society after the war. David felt a chill as the implications became clear. Are you saying Helena's father was essentially running a secret Allied operation from inside the German government? That's exactly what these documents suggest, Dr. Torres replied. And if it's true, it means that hundreds, possibly thousands of people owe their lives not to luck or coincidence, but to one of the most daring double-agent operations in history. Dr. Peterson pulled David aside. This is way beyond normal security protocol. If these documents are authentic, they're going to cause major waves in the historical community and possibly in international relations. Some of the people named in these papers as collaborators are still alive or their families are still prominent in European politics. Agent Chun overheard and nodded grimly, which is why we need to be very careful about how this information is released. Some of the names in these documents, let's just say there are people who have built their reputations on very different versions of what they did during the war. David thought about Helena, sitting in the assembly hall, probably wondering what was taking so long. What about Mrs. Kozlov? Does she understand what she's potentially unleashed here? Professor Mitchell laughed, but there was no humor in it. I don't think any of us understood what she was unleashing. According to her father's journal, Helena wasn't just an innocent child during the war. She was actively involved in some of the operations. What do you mean? David asked. Dr. Torres opened the journal to a page dated 1944. Listen to this entry, Helena proved invaluable today. Her youth and innocence allow her to move through checkpoints without suspicion. She successfully delivered documents to the American contact in Geneva and returned with the new list of priority evacuees. She was 17 years old and working as a courier for her father's network. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed this information. Helena hadn't just inherited her father's secrets, she had helped create them. Agent Chun was studying a photograph that had been tucked between the journal pages. This shows Helena with a group of people in what appears to be a safe house. According to the writing on the back, this was taken in Switzerland in early 1945. These other people, we'll need to research who they were, but if they were part of the network, some of them might still be alive. David's radio crackled with another message. Helena was asking for him, wanting to know when she could see her documents again. The crowd around her in the assembly hall was growing, and more media attention was starting to focus on her story. We have a problem, Dr. Peterson said. Word is getting out about what's happening here. I've already had calls from 3 different news agencies asking about secret Nazi documents being discovered at the Peace Assembly. We need to decide how to handle this situation before it gets out of control. Professor Mitchell was still reading through the journal. According to this, Kozlov's network saved over 3,000 people between 1942 and 1945. But more importantly, they also gathered intelligence about German military operations and passed it to the Allies. Some of this information may have helped shorten the war. Dr. Torres added, if that's true, then Wilhelm Kozlov and his daughter aren't just heroes of Holocaust rescue, they're heroes of the entire Allied war effort. Agent Chun closed the folder she'd been examining, which brings us to the key question. Why did they keep this secret for 75 years? If Kozlov had proof of his work with the Allies, he could have cleared his name after the war. David remembered Helena's words from earlier. She said her father was afraid that even with proof, people wouldn't believe him. In 1945, the world wanted justice against anyone who had worked for the German government. He thought revealing the truth might put the people he saved in danger. He might have been right, Professor Mitchell said quietly. Some of the escape routes described in these documents were still being used by people fleeing Eastern Europe during the Cold War. If the Soviets had learned about them in 1945, they could have shut down those escape networks and captured people trying to flee communist countries. Dr. Peterson made a decision. I'm going to recommend that we allow Mrs. Kozlov to make a brief statement to the Assembly, but we're going to need time to properly authenticate these documents and determine the best way to release this information. David, can you explain the situation to her? As David prepared to return to Helena, he realized that the elderly woman who had struggled with her heavy suitcase that morning was about to become one of the most important historical figures of the 21st century. Her simple desire to clear her father's name had uncovered evidence that would force historians to rewrite parts of World War II history. But more than that, Helena's courage in finally sharing her family's secret was about to give closure to hundreds of families who had spent 75 years wondering what had happened to their loved ones. In a world that often seemed short on heroes, Helena Kozlov and her father were about to remind everyone that sometimes the most extraordinary acts of courage happen in complete silence, waiting decades for the right moment to be revealed. As David walked back toward the assembly hall, he couldn't help but wonder how many other secrets were sitting in old suitcases around the world, waiting for someone brave enough to finally tell the truth. When David returned to the assembly hall, he found Helena surrounded by a much larger crowd than before. Word had spread throughout the gathering about the elderly woman with documents that were rewriting World War II history. Diplomats, historians, journalists, and survivors had all gathered around her, each eager to hear her story and examine the evidence she had brought. Helena looked overwhelmed but determined. Despite her age and the obvious fatigue from the emotional morning, she was patiently answering questions and sharing what she remembered about her father's work. David could see she was running on pure adrenaline and the satisfaction of finally being able to tell the truth she had carried for so long. "Mrs. Kozlov," David said gently, approaching through the crowd, "the experts have finished their preliminary examination of your documents. They'd like you to address the full assembly, if you're willing." Helena's eyes widened. "The full assembly? All the world leaders?" "Yes, ma'am. What you've brought today is being recognized as one of the most significant historical discoveries in decades. The assembly chairman wants to give you the opportunity to tell your story to everyone present." Helena looked around at the faces surrounding her, survivors who had found new hope, historians who were reconsidering everything they thought they knew, and families who were finally getting answers about their loved ones. She nodded slowly. "Yes, I will speak. It is what my father would have wanted." Within minutes, the assembly hall was buzzing with excitement. The scheduled program was temporarily suspended as organizers prepared for Helena's unexpected presentation. Dr. Peterson had arranged for the documents to be displayed on large screens, so the entire assembly could see them while Helena spoke. As Helena made her way to the podium, escorted by David, the hall gradually fell silent. Here was an 89-year-old woman, dressed simply in her blue dress and worn coat, about to address world leaders and reveal secrets that had been hidden since before most of them were born. Helena approached the microphone with steady steps, though David could see her hands trembling slightly. She looked out over the audience of over 800 people, presidents, prime ministers, diplomats, survivors, and media representatives from around the world. "My name is Helena Kozlov," she began, her accented voice carrying clearly through the hall's sound system. 75 years ago today, my father was sitting in a bunker in Berlin, destroying the last of his official Nazi documents, but he kept these." She gestured toward the screen, where images of her father's rescue documents were now displayed. A murmur rippled through the audience as people began to study the documents on the screens. Helena waited for quiet before continuing. "My father, Wilhelm Kozlov, worked for the German Foreign Ministry from 1940 to 1945. To the world, he appeared to be a loyal Nazi official, but in reality, he was working every day to save innocent lives and help the Allied forces." Helena went on to describe her father's double life, how he had used his position to warn Jewish families about planned deportations, how he had helped create false identity documents, and how he had coordinated with resistance groups across Europe. As she spoke, more documents appeared on the screens, maps showing escape routes, lists of saved families, and correspondence with Allied intelligence offices. The reaction in the hall was extraordinary. Survivors wept openly as they saw evidence of rescue operations they had never known existed. Historians frantically took notes. realizing they were witnessing the revelation of a completely unknown chapter of World War II history. Government. Officials looked stunned as they processed the implications of what Helena was revealing, but it was Helena's next revelation that truly shocked the assembly. "I was not just my father's daughter during the war," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I was his partner. From the age of 16, I helped coordinate rescue operations. I carried messages between safe houses. I escorted families to escape. Roots, I lived a double life just as my father did." The hall erupted in amazed murmurs. Helena Kozlov wasn't just the keeper of historical secrets, she was herself a World War II hero who had spent 75 years in silence. Dr. Torres, who had been invited to provide expert commentary, approached the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, our preliminary examination suggests that these documents are authentic. They provide evidence of rescue operations that saved over 3,000 lives and intelligence, activities that may have helped shorten the war. This represents one of the most significant discoveries in Holocaust and World War II research." Questions began flying from the audience. Journalists wanted to know why the documents had been kept secret for so long. Government officials wanted to understand the implications for historical treaties and relationships. Survivors and their families wanted to know if their own relatives might be mentioned in the documents. Helena answered each question with remarkable clarity and detail. She explained how her father had feared that revealing his activities in 1945 would endanger the people he had saved and the networks that were still helping people escape communist Eastern Europe. She described the burden of keeping such enormous secrets and her decision to finally speak out while she was still able to do so. One particularly emotional moment came when Ruth Goldman, the Holocaust survivor who had first recognized her family's name on Helena's list, stood up to address the assembly. "Mrs. Kozlov, on behalf of my family and all the families represented in your father's documents, I want to thank you for your courage in finally sharing this truth. For 75 years, we survivors have wondered how some of us were lucky enough to escape when so many others didn't. Now we know it wasn't luck, it was the brave actions of people like your father and yourself." The assembly broke into sustained applause. Helena wiped tears from her eyes as she realized that her father's reputation was finally being restored, and that the truth about the rescue operations was finally being told, but the revelations weren't over. Professor Mitchell approached the microphone with a particular document in his hand. "Mrs. Kozlov, there's something else in your father's papers that the assembly needs to know about. We found evidence that some of the people your father saved went on to make significant contributions to the rebuilding of Europe after the war. Scientists who helped develop medical treatments, artists who preserved cultural traditions, political leaders who helped establish democratic governments. Your father didn't just save lives, he helped save the future of European civilization." The magnitude of what Helena and her father had accomplished was beginning to sink in for everyone present. This wasn't just a story about individual heroism. During wartime, it was about how the actions of a few brave people had helped shape the world that emerged from the war. Helena looked out over the assembly, seeing faces filled with admiration, gratitude, and amazement. For the first time in 75 years, she was no longer carrying her father's secrets alone. The burden that had defined her entire adult life was finally shared with the world. "I have one more thing to say," Helena announced, her voice now steady and strong. "My father made me promise not just to keep his secrets, but to share them when the time was right. Today, surrounded by leaders who are committed to peace and remembering history, I believe that time has come. But I also want to make a new promise." The hall fell completely silent. "I promise that these documents will be made available to researchers, to families searching for their history, and to anyone who wants to understand the truth about what happened during the war. The secrets end today. The truth belongs to everyone." The standing ovation that followed lasted for several minutes. Helena Kozlov, who had entered the assembly hall that morning as an unknown elderly woman with a heavy suitcase, was leaving as one of the most remarkable historical witnesses of the century. Her decision to finally speak had not only cleared her father's name, but had given hope and closure to hundreds of families and changed the way the world understood one of its darkest periods. As David escorted Helena back to her seat, he realized that he had been privileged to witness one of those rare moments when history is literally rewritten before your eyes. The morning's routine security check had become a revelation that would be studied and celebrated for generations to come. In the hours following Helena's address to the Assembly, the Geneva International Conference Center became the epicenter of one of the most intensive historical investigations in modern times. Experts from around the world were being flown in on emergency flights, and the conference center's communication systems were overwhelmed with calls from researchers, government agencies, and media outlets desperate for more information. Dr. Torres had assembled a team of specialists in her makeshift command center in what had originally been planned as a storage room. The team included handwriting experts, paper and ink analysts, World War II historians, genealogists, and even cryptographers to examine some of the coded messages found in Wilhelm Kozlov's papers. "We need to approach this systematically, Dr. Torres announced to her team. "Every document needs to be photographed, cataloged, and cross-referenced with existing historical records. We also need to verify as many of the names and locations as possible." Professor Mitchell was working with a team of graduate students who had been hastily recruited from universities across Europe. They were using laptops and tablets to cross-reference the names in Helena's documents with historical databases, immigration records, and survivor testimonies from archives around the world. "This is incredible," Mitchell called out to Dr. Torres. "We've already found matches for over 200 of the names in immigration records from the United States, Canada, Australia, and South America. These people really did escape, and many of them went on to have families and careers in their new countries." Meanwhile, Agent Chin was coordinating with law enforcement and intelligence agencies to verify the authenticity of the official documents and correspondence found in Helena's suitcase. The task was complicated by the fact that many of the agencies and officials mentioned in the documents no longer existed, and some governments were reluctant to open classified files from the war period. Dr. Peterson approached Dr. Torres with updates from the technical analysis. "The paper dating tests confirm that all the documents we've tested so far are from the 1940s. The ink analysis is consistent with writing instruments available during that time period, and the handwriting analysis has confirmed that the same person wrote most of these documents over a period of several years. But it was the work being done by the genealogy team that was producing the most emotional results, led by Michael Goldman, Ruth's grandson. They were using modern DNA databases and family history websites to track down living descendants of the people mentioned in Wilhelm Kozlov's rescue lists. "Dr. Torres, you need to see this," Michael called out excitedly. "We found a family in Toronto whose grandfather was on one of Wilhelm's lists. They've been trying to trace their family history for years, but they never knew exactly how their grandfather escaped from Europe. The details in these documents match perfectly with the family stories that have been passed down." The team had also made contact with several Holocaust research centers and museums around the world. The response had been unanimous. Nothing like Wilhelm Kozlov's operational archive had ever been discovered. Most resistance and rescue operations from the war had left behind scattered evidence at best. Wilhelm's methodical record-keeping was providing researchers with an unprecedented look at how rescue networks actually functioned during the war. Dr. Sarah Weiss from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum had flown in from Washington and was examining Wilhelm's personal journal with intense fascination. This diary provides insights into the psychological aspects of resistance work that we've never had access to before, she explained to the team. Wilhelm wrote about the constant fear of discovery, the weight of making life-and-death decisions, and the emotional toll of maintaining his cover identity. It's an invaluable historical document in its own right. Meanwhile, Helena had been moved to a private room where she could rest and receive medical attention. The emotional stress of finally sharing her father's secrets, combined with her advanced age, had exhausted her. But she refused to leave the conference center. Insisting on staying to answer any questions the research teams might have, David found himself serving as Helena's unofficial guardian and liaison with the research teams. Every few hours, experts would come to ask her about specific details in the documents or to clarify something her father had written in his journal. "Mrs. Kozlov," Dr. Weiss asked during one of these sessions, "your father wrote about someone he called the rabbi, who helped coordinate safe houses in Switzerland. Do you remember anything about this person?" Helena's eyes lit up. "Oh yes, Rabbi David Stern. He was wonderful. He had contacts throughout Switzerland who would take in refugees. My father and I met with him several times. He died many years ago, but I believe his son became a rabbi as well. He might still be alive." Within hours, the research team had located Rabbi Stern's son in Zurich. When contacted, he confirmed that his father had indeed worked with a German official during the war to help refugees, though he had never known the official's name. He agreed to provide his father's papers to help verify Helena's account. The validation process wasn't without its challenges. Some of the names mentioned in Wilhelm's documents belonged to people who had built post-war reputations that didn't align with their wartime activities. A few prominent European families were upset to learn that their relatives might have been involved in resistance activities. Fearing it could affect their current political or business interests, Agent Chen was dealing with these sensitive political issues carefully. "We need to remember that revealing some of this information could impact current international relationships," she explained to Dr. Torres. "Some of the people mentioned in these documents are still alive, or their children are in positions of power. We need to consider the implications of making everything public immediately." But the most significant validation came from an unexpected source. The British National Archives announced that they had found references to Source Wilhelm in previously classified intelligence files from 1943 to 1945. When cross-referenced with Helena's documents, the operational details matched perfectly. Professor Robert Hayes from Cambridge University, who specialized in British intelligence operations during World War II, had been granted emergency access to the classified files. The British clearly knew about Wilhelm Kozlov's activities and were actively supporting them, he announced to the team. "There are records of payments, equipment drops, and coordination meetings. This wasn't just a lone individual acting on his own, this was an official Allied operation." The discovery of the British files transformed the investigation from a historical curiosity into a matter of international significance. If Wilhelm Kozlov had been an official Allied asset, then his actions during the war needed to be recognized, not just as individual heroism, but as legitimate military operations. Dr. Torres called a meeting with all the team leaders to discuss their findings. "Based on everything we've discovered in the past 12 hours, I'm prepared to state that Helena Kozlov's documents are authentic, historically significant, and represent one of the most important discoveries in World War II research." Professor Mitchell nodded in agreement. "The validation from multiple independent sources is overwhelming. These documents are going to revolutionize our understanding of resistance operations during the war." Agent Chen added, "From a legal and political standpoint, we're going to need to work with multiple governments to determine the best way to release this information. But there's no question that it needs to be made public." As the validation process continued into the evening, Helena sat in her private room, finally at peace after 75 years of carrying her father's secrets. The burden she had inherited as a teenage resistance fighter was finally being shared with the world, and the truth about her father's heroism was being recognized by experts and governments around the globe. David checked on her regularly, amazed at how a routine security screening had led to such an extraordinary discovery. Helena dozed fitfully in her chair, occasionally waking to answer another question from the research teams, but always with a smile on her face. "I wish my father could see this," she told David during one of his visits. "He would be so proud to know that his work is finally being recognized, and that the families he saved are finally learning the truth about what happened to their loved ones." The investigation would continue for weeks, but the preliminary validation was complete. Helena Kozlov and her father Wilhelm had indeed operated one of the most successful rescue networks of World War II, and their story was about to become one of the most celebrated examples of courage and resistance in human history. 3 months after Helena's revelation at the Peace Assembly, the ripple effects of her father's documents were being felt around the world. What had started as one elderly woman's desire to clear her father's name had become a global phenomenon that was reuniting families, rewriting history books, and inspiring a new generation of researchers and activists. Michael Goldman had taken a leave of absence from his genealogy company to work full-time on what had become known as the Kozlov Project. Using Wilhelm's detailed records, his team had created a database that was helping families trace relatives they had thought were lost forever. The results were nothing short of miraculous. Every week, we're making connections that seemed impossible. Just a few months ago, Michael explained to a journalist from the BBC, yesterday, we helped a woman in Montreal discover that her grandfather, who she thought had died in the camps, actually escaped to Argentina and started a new family there. She has cousins she never knew existed. The most emotional reunion had taken place in New York, where Sarah Fisher, a 91-year-old Holocaust survivor, was finally reunited with her brother Isaac, whom she hadn't seen since they were separated in Berlin in 1943, according to Wilhelm's records. Isaac had been among the first people evacuated through the Switzerland route. For 78 years, I thought my brother was dead, Sarah said through tears at their reunion at JFK Airport. I mourned him. I said prayers for him. I named my son after him. And all this time, he was alive in California, just 3,000 miles away from me. Isaac, now 89, had spent decades trying to find information about his sister, but the records from their separation had been destroyed during the war. Without Wilhelm's detailed documentation, they never would have found each other. Helena Kozlov gave me back my sister, Isaac said simply. How do you thank someone for giving you back part of your family? The academic world was equally transformed by Helena's revelation. Universities around the world were offering new courses on resistance operations and rescue networks during World War II. Wilhelm Kozlov's operational methods were being studied as examples of how to organize underground humanitarian activities. In conflict zones, Dr. Torres had left her position at the International Institute for Holocaust Research to establish the Kozlov Foundation, dedicated to researching and documenting rescue operations during World War II and other conflicts. The foundation had received funding from governments, private donors, and even some of the families whose relatives had been saved by Wilhelm's network. Wilhelm Kozlov showed us that even in the darkest circumstances, individuals can make an extraordinary difference, Dr. Torres explained at the foundation's opening ceremony. His methods of organization, communication, and security are being studied by humanitarian organizations working in conflict zones today. Professor Mitchell had been granted access to additional classified archives in Britain, France, and the United States, where references to Wilhelm's network were providing new insights into Allied intelligence operations during the war. His research was revealing that Wilhelm's rescue operations had been part of a much larger network of double agents and resistance fighters than historians had previously understood. We're discovering that the line between intelligence operations and humanitarian rescue work was much blurrier than we thought, Mitchell explained in his latest academic paper. Wilhelm's network wasn't just saving lives, it was gathering intelligence that helped the Allies understand German military operations and civilian morale. But perhaps the most significant changes were happening to the individuals, whose lives had been directly touched by Helena's revelation. Ruth Goldman had become an unofficial spokesperson for families who had been reunited through the Kozlov Project. She had started a support group for elderly survivors who were processing new information about their wartime experiences. It's been difficult, Ruth admitted to a counselor during one of the group sessions. For 75 years, I believed one version of my family's story. Now I'm learning that so much of what I thought I knew was incomplete or wrong. It's wonderful to have answers, but it's also overwhelming. David Chen had also found his life transformed by his encounter with Helena. He had been promoted to head of security for international conferences, but more importantly, he had discovered a passion for historical preservation that he never knew he had. He had started volunteering at a local museum, helping to catalog and preserve historical documents. Helena taught me that history isn't just something that happened in the past, David reflected. It's something that's alive, something that can change the present if we're brave enough to tell the truth about it. Helena herself had become something of an international celebrity, though she remained uncomfortable with the attention. She had moved from her small apartment to a comfortable care facility, where she could receive better medical attention while continuing to work with researchers and journalists. "I never wanted to be famous," Helena told a reporter from the Washington Post. "I just wanted people to know that my father was a good man. But if my story helps other families find their loved ones, then I'm grateful for all the attention." Helena had also started writing her memoirs, working with a professional author to document not just her father's rescue operations, but her own experiences as a teenage resistance fighter. The book, tentatively titled Secrets in a Suitcase, was already being compared to Anne Frank's diary in terms of its potential historical significance. The international implications of Helena's revelation had been equally significant. Several European governments had issued formal apologies for failing to recognize Wilhelm's contributions during the post-war period. The German government had posthumously awarded Wilhelm the Order of Merit, one of the country's highest civilian honors. Wilhelm Kozlov represents the best of what people can be, even in the worst of circumstances, the German chancellor said during the award ceremony. His courage and humanity remind us that even those who appear to be on the wrong side of history can be working for justice and peace. Museums around the world were creating exhibits dedicated to Wilhelm's rescue network and the broader theme of hidden heroes during World War II. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum was planning a permanent exhibition featuring Helena's documents and the stories of families who had been reunited through the Kozlov project. But for all the public recognition and historical significance, the most meaningful changes were the personal ones. Families who had spent decades wondering about lost relatives finally had answers. Children and grandchildren learned that their family's survival hadn't been due to luck, but to the courage and sacrifice of people like Wilhelm and Helena Kozlov. Elena Rodriguez, whose grandmother had been saved by Wilhelm's network, traveled from Madrid to Geneva to meet Helena in person. "My grandmother always told us that an angel helped our family escape from France," Elena said. "Now I know that angel was your father." The meeting between Elena and Helena was typical of dozens that were happening around the world. Helena, despite her advanced age and fragile health, made time to meet with as many families as possible. Each meeting reinforced her belief that revealing her father's secrets had been the right decision. "Every time I meet someone whose family was saved by my father, I feel him smiling," Helena told Elena. "He would be so happy to know that his work is still bringing families together, even 75 years later." As Helena approached her 90th birthday, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that morning when she struggled to lift her heavy suitcase at the security checkpoint. The burden of secrets that had defined her entire adult life had been transformed into a legacy of hope and healing that would outlive her by generations. "I spent 75 years carrying my father's secrets," Helena said in her final interview, before her memoir was published. "Now I get to spend whatever time I have left watching those secrets bring joy and closure to families around the world. It's the greatest gift I could have asked for." The Kozlov project continued to grow, with new volunteers and researchers joining every month. What had started as one woman's desire to honor her father's memory had become a movement that was changing how the world understood courage, resistance, and the power of truth to heal even the deepest wounds of history. 2 years after Helena Kozlov first opened her father's suitcase at the Geneva security checkpoint, the world gathered once again to honor courage and remember history. But this time, the ceremony was specifically dedicated to Helena and Wilhelm Kozlov, and to all the hidden heroes whose stories had emerged as a result of their bravery. The International Day of Hidden Heroes had been officially recognized by the United Nations, with ceremonies taking place in over 50 countries. The main event was held in Geneva, in the same conference hall where Helena had first shared her father's secrets with the world. Helena, now 91 and using a wheelchair, sat in the front row surrounded by dozens of families whose lives had been changed by her revelation. Despite her declining health, her eyes were bright and alert as she watched the proceedings that honored her. Father's Legacy. The ceremony began with a video presentation showing the global impact of the Kozlov project. Statistics flashed on the screen that seemed almost impossible to believe. Over 800 families had been reunited with relatives they thought were lost forever. More than 3,000 people had learned the true story of how their families survived the war. 15. New historical archives had been discovered in private collections as other families came forward with their own hidden documents. The Kozlov Revolution, as historians were calling it, had fundamentally changed how people thought about resistance during World War II. No longer was it seen as the work of just organized military groups or famous leaders. Helena and Wilhelm's story had shown that ordinary people working in secret could have extraordinary impact. David Chun, now Director of International Security Coordination, served as Master of Ceremonies for the event. He had never forgotten that morning when a routine security check had changed his life and the lives of thousands of others. 2 years ago, I thought I was just doing my job when I helped an elderly woman with a heavy suitcase, David said to the assembled crowd. I had no idea that I was about to witness one of the most important historical revelations of our time. Helena Kozlov taught all of us that truth has its own timeline and that courage is never too late. The first speaker was Dr. Torres, whose Kozlov Foundation had become one of the world's leading organizations for researching hidden resistance activities. She presented the findings from 2 years of intensive research into Wilhelm's network and similar operations around the world. Wilhelm Kozlov's documentation has helped us identify at least 12 other rescue networks operating during World War II that we never knew existed, Dr. Torres announced. We estimate that these hidden operations saved over 20,000 lives. Helena's courage in sharing her father's secrets has literally rewritten the history of the Holocaust and World War II resistance. The audience erupted in applause as Helena smiled from her wheelchair. She had achieved far more than she had ever dreamed possible when she decided to finally tell her father's story. Michael Goldman, now Director of Genealogical Research for the Kozlov Foundation, presented the most moving part of the ceremony, a reunion of families who had found each other through Wilhelm's documents. Nearly 200 people took the stage, representing 5 generations of families whose survival could be traced directly to Wilhelm's rescue operations. These are living monuments to Wilhelm Kozlov's courage, Michael said as families embraced on stage. Each of these people exists today because one man decided that saving lives was worth risking his own. Among the families on stage were Sarah and Isaac Fisher, the 91 and 89-year-old siblings who had been reunited after 78 years apart. Their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren had formed an extended family network that now spanned 3 continents. Helena gave us back our family history, Sarah said when invited to speak. But more than that, she gave us hope that even the worst tragedies can have hidden blessings waiting to be discovered. The ceremony also honored the academic impact of Helena's revelation. Universities around the world had established the Kozlov Scholars Program, providing funding for students to research hidden aspects of World War II history. Over 300 graduate students and researchers were now working on projects directly inspired by Wilhelm's documents. Professor Mitchell, who had become the world's leading expert on World War II double agents, announced the publication of a comprehensive academic study based on Wilhelm's papers. The Kozlov Archive, as the collection was now known, had become one of the most important historical resources for understanding resistance operations during the war. Wilhelm Kozlov kept better records than most government agencies, Mitchell said to laughter from the audience. His attention to detail has given us insights into how resistance networks actually function that we could never have imagined before. But the most significant recognition came from the families of other German officials who had worked secretly for the Allies during the war. Inspired by Helena's courage, dozens of families had come forward with their own hidden documents and stories. The revelation that Wilhelm's network was part of a much larger, underground movement within the German government had shocked historians and governments around the world. Helena showed us that keeping family secrets doesn't always honor our loved ones, said Klaus Weber, whose grandfather had been a German diplomat who secretly helped American prisoners of war escape. Sometimes the greatest honor we can give them is to tell the truth about their courage. Klaus and 12 other families had formed the Hidden Heroes Project, working to identify and honor other German officials who had secretly worked against the Nazi regime. Their research was revealing that resistance within the German government had been far more extensive than anyone had previously known. Agent Chun, who had overseen the initial authentication of Helena's documents, announced that Interpol was creating a new unit dedicated to helping families recover lost historical documents and reconnect with their heritage. The Helena Protocol, as it was being called, provided a framework for handling sensitive historical discoveries that could impact families and international relations. Helena Kozlov showed us that sometimes the most important discoveries come from the most unexpected sources, Chun said. We're now better prepared to help other families who may be carrying similar secrets. The ceremony included a special video tribute to Helena, featuring interviews with dozens of people whose lives had been touched by her father's work. Survivors, their children and grandchildren, researchers, and government officials all shared how Wilhelm and Helena's story had affected them, but perhaps the most moving tribute came from a group of children from a Geneva elementary school who had learned about Helena's story and written her letters of thanks. Their teacher read some of the letters aloud, including one from 8-year-old Marie Dubois. Dear Mrs. Helena, thank you for being brave and telling the truth about your father. My grandmother says that sometimes grown-ups keep secrets because they think it's safer, but you showed that telling the truth can help people find their families. You are my hero. As the ceremony drew to a close, Helena was invited to address the audience one final time. David wheeled her to the podium where she sat quietly for a moment, looking out over the crowd of nearly 1,000 people who had gathered to honor her father's memory. When I was 16 years old, my father made me promise to keep his secrets. Until it was safe to tell them, Helena began, her voice soft but clear through the microphone. For 75 years, I wondered if that time would ever come. 2 years ago, sitting in this same hall, I finally knew it had. Helena paused, emotion evident in her voice. But I never imagined that telling one man's story would lead to so many families finding each other, so many secrets being revealed, so many hearts being healed. My father saved 3,000 lives during the war. But sharing his story has touched the lives of millions. The audience rose in a sustained standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Helena wiped tears from her eyes as she looked out over the crowd of people whose lives had been changed by her decision to finally speak the truth. I am 91 years old, and I know I don't have much time left, Helena continued when the applause finally died down. But I'm no longer afraid of what will happen when I'm gone, because I know my father's story will live on. The truth is stronger than secrets, love is stronger than fear, and hope is stronger than despair. Helena concluded with words that would be carved into the memorial that was being built in her honor. To all the families still searching for their lost loved ones, to all the people carrying secrets they're afraid to share, to all the heroes whose stories haven't been told yet, remember that it's never too late for the truth. My father waited 75 years to be recognized as a hero. Some truths are worth waiting for. 6 months after the ceremony, Helena Kozlov passed away peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by friends and some of the families her father had saved. Her death made international headlines with world leaders, historians, and ordinary families all paying tribute to the woman who had single-handedly changed how the world understood courage and resistance. But Helena's greatest legacy wasn't the honors she received or the history books that were rewritten because of her courage. Her greatest legacy was the ongoing work of